Welcome back to another season of His Shepherd's Heart. I'm back with my dear brother, Humberto Porras. Nice to have you back.
Thank you. Buenos dias. It's good to be with you. It's good to be with the audience today. God bless you guys.
Now, we also have a special guest. I hesitate to introduce you because you've introduced yourself so well on a video that's gone viral. Okay. This is Mottel Baleston. Mottel is a dear friend of mine for over a quarter of a century now.
Yes.
So we go way back.
But I was very young back then.
No gray hair. But the beard has stayed the same.
That's very important.
Well, here's what I'd like to do. You've given your testimony recently. It's gone viral. How many views?
On Facebook, there's over 8 million views.
8 million views.
Because of people sharing it. On YouTube, it's on in around 4 or 5 different languages, total of about 250,000 views. And even the folks, the ministry with whom I made it, had no idea it would do that. But the Lord has really blessed it. It's reached a lot of people, and it really is what now I'm noted for.
Well, let's do this. Let's take a look at the video,
okay.
And then I know we're going to have some, Humberto and I are going to have some questions about you.
Very good.
Let's take a look at that video.
Here's what you need to do. You've got to first shave your head. You dress all in black. You've got to wear a white robe, eat only kosher foods. You've got to become a vegetarian. You face Jerusalem. You've got to face India when you pray. You pray only in Hebrew, and you grow a nice big beard. And if you do all of those outward cultural things, you'll discover the God of the universe. And I'm thinking, this is crazy that someone thinks that they can force their culture on God, and that God's going to be impressed by what you wear, what direction you face when you pray, what you eat, and all these sorts of things. It seemed to me that if there was a God out there who could be known, he should be able to be recognized no matter where I face, no matter how I'm dressed, because he's God. Growing up, we always understood that we had our Bible and the Gentiles had their Bible, the New Testament, and that they were two completely separate books. Because the only people I knew who were believers in Jesus were all people in our public school who were Italian Catholic, I imagined that Jesus was Italian. And so the understanding that he's actually Jewish was a shock. And then to hear that the New Testament was written by Jews, I couldn't believe it. My expectation was that the New Testament was like my grandparents had told me. It was a book on how to persecute the Jews, and it's something you should stay away from. Of course, when you're told you should stay away from something, curiosity gets the best of you, and you've got to see it. When I opened the New Testament, I was expecting to find a handbook on how to persecute the Jews. My grandparents had warned me that it was written by people who killed the Jews. That's what I was expecting to see, and yet when I'm opening it, I'm reading a story written by Jews about Jewish people. The New Testament was a fascinating book. And so as I opened this book in the library, I kind of looked around, made sure that none of my friends had seen me taking a Christian Bible off the shelf. And I open it, here's the first sentence. It says, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." So 3 people are mentioned, and they're all Jewish. I was very shocked. And as I continued to read, I'm reading the story of a Jewish man who was born in a Jewish village, in a Jewish country, and one day walks into a synagogue and announces that he is the Messiah. The more I read the words of Jesus, the more I became attracted to him. It was as beautiful as anything I had ever read in any other part of the Bible. As I came to faith that Yeshua, that Jesus was the Messiah, it was clear that that was the most Jewish thing I could do. This is not a person who's a renegade to our people. This is the one who was promised in our Bible, the 53rd chapter of Isaiah. It is astonishing. If you would just read that chapter, just without the Bible being around it, you would say, oh, this is some Christian Bible. This is Jesus. When you realize, though, that it's in the middle of our Bible, our Jewish Bible. When I first came to faith, I dared not tell my father, because this is a time period in the the 1970s, when there were lots of gurus and cults. And he was very concerned about me getting involved in some crazy sect and going off someplace. So I waited for months. And when I finally told him, he was very skeptical. On his own then, he started to read about Jesus as well. About a year and a half later, I told him that the fellow who wrote one of the books that he had read, that this fellow was giving a lecture in the city of New York. And he agreed to come out to hear that person. And one of the most amazing moments of my life was the speaker said, "Would everyone here who is a Jewish believer in Jesus, would you raise your hand?" And I raised my hand. My father also raised his hand. And I looked over and I said, "Pop," he didn't say would all the Jews raise their hand. He said, "Would all the Jewish believers in Jesus raise their hand?" And my father looked over and he said, "Yes, I heard what he said." The decision to come to faith in Jesus as the Messiah was not something that was a momentary lark. It wasn't something that was a passing fad. And I could see changes in myself that I knew were not from within myself. I had kind of tapped in to a truth for our Jewish people that was very powerful.
So this testimony of yours, it's generated a lot of discussion.
Yes, obviously on Facebook, anyone is free to respond in any way to something that's been shared, but many believers took it upon themselves to share the video into their general friends lists, and many of those friends responded in some quite unusual ways.
Well, you were telling me this morning over breakfast that somebody even said, "You're not really Jewish, that's not even a real beard," right?
A number of people became so angered about it, people who are Jewish who are not believers in Yeshua, that they were looking for some reason to discredit either the testimony or myself. And so one of the more silly things was, "Oh, you're not really Jewish. Did you paste on the beard? You know, who taught you how to pronounce those Jewish words?" And of course, this is silliness. I mean, very simply, all four of my grandparents were born into traditional Jewish villages in Eastern Europe in the late 1890s. All four grew up in Orthodox Judaism. All four of my grandparents were Orthodox. The home that I was born into in Brooklyn, New York, was an average traditional Jewish home of the day. No, it wasn't observant, it wasn't Orthodox, but it was like so many other millions of Jewish people. We had a deep respect for our culture, for our background, and at the same time, as a young person, I was always told that I would have the ability to investigate these things for myself and to make my own decisions.
Well, you said something about who taught you how to pronounce these Jewish words. Speaking of Jewish words,
Right.
Tell us about your name.
Okay.
You're the only person I know or have ever known with that name.
Sure. Well, the name Mottel is my real name, by the way. It's the name on my birth certificate.
It's not your star name.
No, it's not my star name. I don't see any stars here. No, it's my real name. It's the name on my birth certificate. And it tells you I was born in a rather traditional Jewish place in the Holy Land, Brooklyn, New York. And at least that's how we considered it. And my mother was very connected with her Yiddish background. My mother, till the day she passed away at a rather young age, continued to speak Yiddish. She was very connected with Yiddishkeit, and so she had a very strong affinity for all things Yiddish. It wasn't until around 5 years ago, as I began researching my genealogy, that I was looking at the records of some of the people in our family and in the village in the Ukraine where a number of the members of our family are from. There were many people by the name of Mottel in that village.
I remember you telling me a few years back, I think I was visiting you in Jersey at the time, that you were at a Holocaust memorial
Oh my goodness.
observance, and people in your synagogue were reading through names.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us what you saw there or what you experienced?
What a story. I was, at that point, I was associate Messianic rabbi of a congregation in New Jersey, and we had an opportunity to participate with the community on Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day, where we would do a reading of names. And we brought all of the young people, most of them were Jewish, brought them out to participate, to read names. We had no idea of what we would be handed, but we all agreed to participate, myself, a couple of other adults, and 8 or 9 of the young people. Curiously, 2 of the young people who were there, their grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. These are 2 of the believing Jewish young folk we had there. And so I get a list of like 3 pages of names, and the average American would not have been able to pronounce most of these names because they were very Yiddish names. With my background, I was familiar with this. So I started to read the names and reading into a microphone, and there were a scattered number of people in this park. And all of a sudden, as I'm reading down the list, I froze. There was someone with the name Mottel, Mottel Fivkin. And so I read the name. Go down around 15 more names, and there's, again, someone with the name Mottel. By the time I had read the 100 names, there were 4 Muttels. And these were individuals in that area of the Ukraine whose names were recorded as having been killed in the Holocaust. And so this was a generation that we lost. And most likely, in an effort to kind of remember that, my parents gave me that name Mottel, which was a reminder of the roots of our family in Eastern European Jewish circles.
Mm-hmm. So my desire today is I wanted, everybody to get to know Mottel, but Humberto, this is the first time you're meeting Mottel too. And I know I introduced you guys off camera as soon as we got here this morning, but what runs through your minds when you hear a testimony like this?
Well, I think it really is exciting because I think it's just a sign of the times in which we're living. We're really one of the signs of Messiah is a great move of God, I believe, upon the nation of Israel. God's eyes have never been, not upon Israel. They've always been upon Israel. But yet the Bible speaks about a time where his eyes are going to be focused on Gentiles and reaching out to Gentile nations. But I'm very much convinced that towards the age of time, then in a certain sense, the eyes of God return to Israel. Not that they ever left, but again, something is going to be done that God promised Abraham and all of the prophets. And that is the full restoration of Israel. That is bringing Israel back into their land and all of these wonderful things that God has promised. So it's exciting to see this because it is a sign of the times. I think a time of the return of Messiah. So it's a great news.
Excellent. Yeah.
I know that you lead a predominantly Gentile congregation, a Hispanic congregation. How would Mottel be received at your congregation?
Well, in my congregation, I think they would be very excited to receive Mottel because we've been for a while really teaching them the necessity to love Israel and to love the Jewish people. And so we're growing in our way to show that love more than just in prayer and in words, but in actions and in deeds. And so I think they would be excited to be able to learn because we've always taught them that the Jewish people have very much depth of knowledge and wisdom that we don't understand because we weren't raised in that culture and we don't have a lot of understanding that they have because of their tradition. So I think they would be very excited to be able to draw from that and to understand from that and to perceive things that we don't understand because, again, of all the traditions and the knowledge that they have.
So Mottel, how's your Spanish?
It's not very good. I'm sure that in heaven it will be a lot better.
Well said, sir.
I understood that's the politically correct thing to say. I understand where I am. But the testimony as they had it there in the video, one of the things that gave rise to so many of the comments is that they took 45 minutes of my speaking, which in the studio in New York City, and it was all filmed by a Jewish believer, and then he edited it, but he chopped it up to make it very dramatic. So people were saying at the beginning of the video, he said, this guy doesn't know what he's doing, because I had mentioned the way that they edited it, that you turn to Jerusalem. No, you turn to India.
Right.
What I was doing is I had contrasted 2 different things I had seen in my coming to faith. So let me just share that briefly. As I was investigating spiritual things in my youth, I was about 20, 21, I had many friends in New York City who were Jewish, and they were being one by one pulled into some of the Eastern religions that were prevalent at that time. Various gurus were coming to America. And I watched as friends like with the name Moskowitz got pulled into various Eastern religions. And they would say, come to my meeting. You have to hear this. And so I would come to these various meetings in New York City, and they said that if you want to know the truth of the universe, here is what you do. First of all, you've got to dress all in white. Then you've got to face India when you pray. When you pray, you have to pray in the Sanskrit language.
So you're comparing and contrasting
Yes.
this with Judaism.
And so they continued on. They said you have to become a vegetarian, and if you do all of these things, you'll know the truth of the universe. Now, on the other hand, I had other friends who came from average Jewish backgrounds who became very orthodox and started going to the yeshiva in the next neighborhood over. They said, come to our meetings. And at those meetings, they said, here's what you have to do to know the truth of the universe. First of all, you've got to dress all in black, which is
The opposite of Indians
yes,
is white.
which is what the Hasidim, many of the Hasidim in Brooklyn, you walk around Brooklyn and they have long black coats. In the middle of the summer, it's long black coats.
Same in Israel. It's
Yeah.
100 plus degrees. They're walking around in black coats.
So you have to dress all in black. You have to face Jerusalem when you pray. You have to pray in Hebrew, and you have to eat only kosher foods. And if you do all of those outward cultural things, then you'll know the truth of the universe. So the comment on the video was, it seemed to me that if there was a God out there who could be known, my prayers would be able to be heard no matter what language they were in, no matter which direction I faced, no matter what I would eat, because if he is sovereign God, then what I do, my culture is a side issue. And it's then that I recognized, admitted to myself, the one thing I never dared to examine were the claims of Jesus to be the Messiah, because up until age 12 or so, the only people I knew who believed in him were all Italian Catholic kids in our neighborhood. So I said, I'm not Italian, so I guess I'm not allowed to believe in this Jesus. And then someone said, well, no, Jesus was Jewish. And I said to them, well, he may have been Jewish, but obviously then he converted. And someone said, no, he never converted. You need to read the story. And when I read the story for myself,
So that's when you secreted the Bible from the library shelf.
I went to the Brooklyn Public Library and pulled the Bible. It's Dewey Decimal 220, by the way. Pulled the Bible off the shelf, and I read the first sentence of this supposedly forbidden book. And it says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. As you continue to read in Matthew, you're reading a Jewish story about a Messiah who came to his people. And then by the end of the story, the doors have swung open wide, and the invitation is given, whosoever will may come.
Let me ask you a question. Okay, you thought Jesus might have been Italian, maybe a convert, didn't know he was Jewish, but was there any intellectual hostility towards Jesus or Christianity from your family?
You know, not so much from my family, but from the neighborhood. You have to understand, it was common as a child. Here's a story. I'm sitting in the barber's chair. I'm 5.5 years old. It's the week before the first day of kindergarten. And so, of course, this is like 1959, 1960s. You've got to get like a real nice haircut. And so I'm sitting at the chair, and I'm looking at the barber's arm. And on the barber's arm, he's an older man with a thick Yiddish accent, is a number. His brother is the other barber. He also had a number. They were sent to a concentration camp, literally a death camp, when they were teenagers, young teenagers. They were strong. They survived the war. All around our community, there were Holocaust survivors. So if you would have asked them, who did this to you? They would have said, people who went to church on Sunday went out and killed Jews on Monday. Now, I understand that seems very harsh, but they had never met any genuine believers.
Yeah.
All of the believers that they had met were members of institutional churches. And the loyalty of those folks was to a church organization, not to Jesus as Messiah. And so the hostility came from the disapproving community.
So when you went public with Mom, Dad, I believe Jesus is the Messiah, I've made him the Lord of my life, that probably didn't go over so well.
No, as I said, I waited 6 months to do that. And my father was very, almost hostile. He said, well, you've joined a cult. You have to understand, well, this is the late 70s.
Yeah, everybody was in a cult in the 70s.
Young people were being drawn into the cults. And so my father was reading these stories, and the first thing he said, okay, you've joined the cult. Where are they going to take you? Have they emptied your bank account ever yet? And will I ever see you again? And I said, Pop, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to keep working at the dental laboratory. That's what I was doing at the time, making crowns and bridges. They haven't asked me for a penny. Later on, he told me he didn't believe me. He said, later on, he admitted to me, he said he thought he'd walk in one day and I'd be gone. But I kept working at the lab. I was at the house. I was paying my share of the rent. And eventually he said, well, let me read one of the books from your cult. So I gave him a very simple book entitled Jesus Was a Jew by a man who's now a friend of mine, Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum. And in this book, it lays out the case for Jesus being a Jew. He read that, then he read a second book. And after reading these things, about 2 or 3 years later, there was a conference in New York City, as I said in the video, with several Messianic speakers. And it was at that point that one of the speakers, kind of a jovial fellow, he wanted everyone here as a Jewish believer raise their hand. My father was sitting in front of me because it was a really packed house. He raised his hand. So that's when I leaned over to him. And ultimately he said, no, I accepted Jesus as my Messiah a few months ago. And I was shocked.
And you didn't think to tell me, Dad?
Because my father was not like a big joiner, but he truly made a genuine profession in Yeshua, in Jesus as his Messiah, and clearly lived a life where this was his faith. Now, my mother died when I was much younger. She was Jewish and also involved in a study. I later on heard this, that she would read the New Testament. But my stepmother, my father remarried several years later, my stepmother is not Jewish, and she was the one who was most skeptical, and she always remained on the fence. But my father maintained a strong testimony as a believer up until the day he died around 10 years ago.
Well, this side of the break, we've only got a few minutes left, but I'm sure everybody would love to know a little bit more about your family. Are you married?
I am married, yes. My wife, Deborah, is from a Sephardic Jewish family, a genuine Sephardic family. Her ancestors at one point had migrated out of Israel into Spain and were in Spain until about 1492. And at that point, with the edict of the expulsion, they kicked all the Jews out of Spain. Many of those Jews scattered around the world, but a good number went to Turkey. And in Turkey, particularly in Western Turkey, around Izmir, Constantinople, there were very large communities of Jewish people who spoke Ladino. Yeah. And Ladino is medieval Spanish. My wife's mother, her first language in the house in New York City that she heard and was raised on was Ladino. Yeah. She didn't learn English until she went to American public school. She's fully Jewish, but she's speaking medieval Spanish, and it's written with Hebrew characters.
It's the Hispanic Yiddish. It's really what it is.
That's what it is. And so that is her background. Our son Jacob is 21. He is an aspiring film editor and director. He wants to be the next Steven Spielberg.
More power to him.
So if anyone out there watching wants to give him a job, please contact me.
Next thing you know, you're going to tell him to eat more. That's awesome. Okay, so one wife, one son.
Only one wife ever and one son.
Excellent.
And so we're doing well. for many years, for about 16 plus years. It was my privilege to be either Messianic rabbi or associate rabbi of a good-sized Messianic congregation in New Jersey. And we saw the Lord do wonderful things in that Messianic Jewish congregation. It was a congregation, because of the fact that it was in a heavily Jewish area, we had about 70% Jewish believers at one time. It was open to everyone. Everyone was able to join freely. But we saw many Jewish men who had not known the Messiah came to faith during that time.
Well, you told me even now your neighborhood where your Messianic synagogue is 50% Jewish.
Yes, it's unusual. It's 50% Jewish. It's a neighborhood in North Jersey. And so we had wonderful opportunities. About 2 years ago, my personal ministry shifted out of there, and I'm simply doing a lot more traveling and a lot more speaking, involved in collaborating with several ministries in some teaching projects, and we've really just seen the Lord bless that ministry.
And you're in New Jersey.
Still in northern New Jersey. I've been privileged to travel recently to Japan, did a full week of teaching in Japan with a translator, traveled around.
I'm jealous.
It's a beautiful, beautiful country. There's a great receptivity among the Japanese people to the Jewish roots of their faith. We had gigantic auditoriums. They were packed. We had 700 people show up in Tokyo to an auditorium that held 650. Wow. So wonderful. The Lord has granted us wonderful experiences, and I'm looking forward to doing more of this.
I like sushi. I'm going to have to go.
There you go.
Japan's going to have to be the place for me. So, Humberto, I appreciate your patience. I know most of this episode we wanted to dedicate to Mottel, to get to know him and his family. Later on in this season, we're going to talk to you also and get to know you and your family again. And we've got several more episodes coming up this season. We're going to delve into some pretty heady and heavy topics. But now you know Mottel, Baleston, Humberto Porras, and I'm Steve Shermett. We've got Odessa, Midland. We've got Clifton.
Ledgewood.
Ledgewood, and we've got Tucson. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
GLC invites you to visit us on our Facebook page at facebook.com/GLCTV. Here you can stay in touch with all of the latest GLC news, along with daily scriptural inspirations, current specials in our bookstore, links to our newest shows, and online media, plus articles from trusted sources. Feel free to drop us a message or a question by posting to our page. Please help us out and like our page by clicking on the thumbs up button. Don't delay, drop by the GLC Facebook page at facebook.com/GLCTV. We want to interact with you today.
Welcome back to The Shepherd's Heart. One of the things that I'd like to do is get a little controversy going. Not in the sense of, hey, let's have a fight for excitement in TV, but there's some issues that people argue over that I don't want to stray away from. I want to benefit our audience, be they pastors, Messianic rabbis, or just lay people. Sometimes we don't like to talk about these topics because they're too controversial, but I thought we should talk about them. So I'm going to start off with a true story. Happened several years ago. And I had this, I don't want to call him a friend, so we'll just say an acquaintance, who told me that at his Messianic synagogue, they dissuaded Gentiles from coming. If a Gentile would come, they would talk him out of it. Say, you know, we're here to reach out to Jewish people. And if we have Gentiles in our congregation, we won't appear to be authentically Jewish, and you'll actually be keeping us from ministering to our target audience. So unless you're in Jewish ministry or married to a Jewish person, would you mind not coming here? I was mortified. I said, that's horrible. We're one in Messiah. The middle wall of partition has been taken down. There's no more Jew. There's no more Gentile. How can you do such a thing? Oh, the guy got so mad at me, and we went back and forth, and we fought over it. And apparently, you know, that was the end of that for a few years. And then he reached out to me and said, you know, Steve, I was wrong. And I'm so sorry. You were right. And he came out to Tucson, and I gave him the pulpit, and he shared how everything changed. I'd like to say he was the only person I've ever met like that, and that was the end of the story. But to this very day, there's still people who do that.
Now, is that the issue that we find in the book of Acts that was happening, kind of like what you're describing? Do you think Paul probably had the same issue with Gentiles coming into Jewish synagogues at that time? Was that part of the problem that was causing kind of the divisions in the church of the first century? Do you think was that probably it?
I think they're related, but
Okay.
it was different in this respect. In Acts, it was like, okay, if you guys become Jewish, you're part of us.
Right.
And with him, it was, if you're not Jewish, we don't want you to be part of us.
But it was kind of the reverse, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It
Yeah.
was just the reverse.
Yeah.
And that's something very important to recognize, that, again, today, if you want to be a Christian, then you got to stop being Jewish.
That's what everybody says.
So again, we've got this problem going on. It's just turned upside down, but it's basically the same problem.
Yep, and I pointed it out to him. I said, you're doing the exact same thing in reverse.
Exactly.
So, Mottel, we had corresponded a little bit about this topic.
Sure.
This was just one piece of a broader topic that you recommended. What are some of your thoughts on this idea?
Well, there's a signature verse that people really need to be aware of. And from that verse, a lot of this whole controversy really will stem. And that verse is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20. Two different people can take a verse and get three different opinions from it.
Yeah, totally.
Now,
Heck, I can get three different opinions from one verse.
I understand. But this verse really is the jumping off point to this whole discussion. So let me read the verse. So it's 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 20. It says there, "And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, I became as under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those who are under the law." And the law there, of course, is the Mosaic law, the Old Testament Jewish Mosaic law. He continues on in verse 21. "To those who are without law, I became as without law, though not being without the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men, that I may by all means save some."
All right. I can see how that applies, definitely. But it seems like Paul was saying, I'm willing to become anything. These other guys were saying, we don't want you with us. Isn't that a little different?
Oh, it's a very different sort of situation. Basically, the question boils down to this. A verse like this 1 Corinthians 9 passage, is this a verse that is there mostly for evangelism, that we should use this as an evangelistic strategy, or do believers have the right to form themselves into sort of congregations and churches that follow just one culture? So the question is this passage just an evangelistic strategy, or is it a strategy for how we should be allowed to, quote unquote, do church? And that is the real question that people still wrestle with.
Yeah.
Because the homogeneous principle is one that was real big around 15, 20 years ago in church growth theory. And that homogeneous principle said that if you have a congregation of people who are made up of mostly the same ethnic background, the same cultural background, even the same economic status, it will attract others of that same background, and the church will grow dramatically. And there were instances where it seemed that that was working. And so the question then began to be asked, is it better to have that sort of thing? Now, on the other hand, other people said, what a terrible witness to the world, that as believers, those who have been born into the same family, we're brothers and sisters in Jesus the Messiah, shouldn't we all be able to show to the world the fact that we can live together?
Multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilanguage.
Across these lines. These lines divide people in the world. Why should they divide people in the body of Messiah? And each side has seemingly good arguments that are rooted in Scripture. It's not as though one side is being selfish and has nothing, no Bible verse to quote. Each side is able to quote passages that seemingly support its view, whether to have a multi-ethnic church with people of various backgrounds, or to have a single cultural church. I've been a member of both. I can make the arguments for both. And really, what we need to see is that there are times when one is going to be most effective, and the Lord will use that congregation. And in other instances and localities, the other might be effective. But it's an emotional question for a lot of people, because they've been divided, or people of minority background have been denied access other places before, and now that they're in the church, they feel as though those barriers should be broken down.
You know, for me, yeah, as many of our viewers know, and as I think you two both know, I lead two congregations. Mm-hmm. I lead one that's ethnically Jewish preferential. Mm-hmm. And by Jewish preferential, I don't mean we prefer Jewish people. I don't mean that at all. I just mean our cultural base is Jewish. And my mindset is, anybody who wants to come, I'd love to have here. Mm-hmm. I don't care if they're Jewish or not. Mm-hmm. The non-denominational church, it's a Tucson church. Mm-hmm. There is no cultural preference. Right. There's the default mode, because I live within this world. Mm-hmm. And people who speak my language live in this world, and people who live in Tucson live within this world. People who speak Japanese and only Japanese won't come.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
It's not because we're against Japanese. We just don't know from Japanese. We don't know anything about Japanese culture. We don't speak the language. They don't speak our language. So they'll start a Japanese church, which is great. I have no problem with that.
Right.
But as soon as they say only English speakers are welcome here, only white people are welcome here, only Japanese people are welcome here, now we're going to start fighting. That's my take on it. Now, you lead a very ethnic congregation. What's your take on this?
Well, again, the congregation where I served, the foundation of who was able to attend for a long time had to do with language. It was language-based. Mm-hmm. I was dealing with people that are first-generation Mexicans. The majority of Mexicans coming into the United States, so obviously don't speak English. So again, that was kind of the way it began, ministering to them. So obviously somebody that spoke English was going to have a problem, because the majority of the ministry was being carried out in Spanish. And so from there, obviously, things began to change after the first generation, and all of the kids began to speak English.
Right.
And it comes to a place where they don't speak hardly Spanish at all. And so again, now we need to minister in English. So as I start ministering in English, then we get to see more Anglo people come in, or more African-American people come in, because now we're speaking in that language.
Do you do that in a separate service or through translation?
We did that totally separate. The reason being that I'm able to speak both languages, so I was able to speak English, and then I would go Spanish. But then that just takes so long, and then it really cuts down on the subject matter that you're able to speak. And then obviously I started feeling kind of like I was becoming like bipolar or something. I was thinking in both languages. So I said, I better stop this. So we just went totally one. So we do one totally Spanish, and then we do one totally English.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I've been wanting to do a Spanish service for several years. We've never been able to pull it off. For a while, though, we had an interpreter in the back room and then our Hispanic guests would wear a headset. Yeah. And we did that for a good year or so. But so you live in South Africa.
Sure.
It's in the 70s.
Yeah.
It's apartheid.
Oh, my goodness.
And only white people are allowed at this church. Yeah. Well, what do you think?
You know, when you look at the history of a number of these eras, whether it be South Africa in the 70s or evangelical churches in the United States in the 1850s, one thing, a lesson from history is some of the most passionate advocates for racial equality have come out of the evangelical church. You look at the whole abolitionist movement in the U.S., they were all evangelicals. The same thing in South Africa. And many people did make the effort to integrate. On the other hand, if you're faced with a society that has these laws, you're then balancing a core question that always comes up against us, to obey God rather than men.
Right.
If someone has redeemed your brother, he is truly your brother in Jesus. Yeah. How dare you bar the door to his entry into the fellowship, despite what the government might say. And I know that this was something that a number of people in South Africa, particularly in the 1980s, they just started ignoring government edicts and simply advertised the services as open to everyone. And some of that actually helped to spur the eventual fall of the horrible system of apartheid. Yeah. And so I think evangelicals, we as believers in Jesus the Messiah, we need to be a little proactive in standing up for the truth of the scriptures and saying, this is a conscience issue. And so for this issue of culture, I think that we need to recognize there is room for both. There is room to have a congregation that's going to be comfortable for maybe for Jewish people coming in, and a congregation that is going to be mixed.
We've been speaking a lot about the word culture. Now, the word culture in Spanish comes from the word culto. El culto means worship.
Oh.
So again, culto is called. It means worship, adoración, worship. And so to me, when we're talking about culture, we're talking about what a certain nation or groups of people worship. And so obviously in India, you've got a worship. You go to Mexico, the Incas, they had a certain worship. You go to Egypt, they had a certain worship. Yeah. But I believe that if we're in Christ, then the focus of our worship changes. Now our worship is Christ. Now our worship is totally different. And I just say this because, again, if I'm correct about what culture means, obviously if we are in Christ, if we are studying out of the same Christ, drinking of the same cup, if we are eating of the same bread, eventually whether I go to Egypt or where I go to China or wherever, this should begin to join us one with the other. If Christ is the foundation of our worship, then I think that the secondary culture, which is the nation that we're from, the language that we speak, I think that kind of begins to take a secondary place to what real worship is, which is Jesus Christ.
I can't help but think, and I don't think this about the story I gave earlier, but a lot of congregations, they're not really of God, they're not really born again, they're racist, and they come up with theological arguments to validate their sinfulness.
Yeah.
The Bible speaks to racism quite clearly, and it even speaks to the system of caste in Philemon. Sure. Here we have a slave who runs away, and the Apostle Paul, who would be at the high end of the spectrum in the body of Messiah, says, you need to treat slaves just as you treat me. I'm in Philemon, there's only one chapter. He says, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He's very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a man and as a brother in the Lord. So if you consider me a partner, welcome him as you would welcome me. Now, he's not talking about a church here. He's just talking about a runaway slave who needs to go home and reconcile with his master. But he's telling the master to treat the slave just like he treats the apostle. There is, Paul says elsewhere, there is neither bond nor free. There's no slaves, there's no free men, there's no men, there's no women, there's no Jews, there's no Gentiles. We're all one in Messiah. Now that, to me, doesn't at all infer that I can't say, hey, let's have a congregation that appeals to millennials. Let's have dark lights, and let's have music that repeats itself, and let's serve coffee, and instead of having pews, let's have tables and snacks.
Right.
Okay, whatever, that's fine. So what's the difference then in that as to what we were talking about before with the apartheid thing?
The difference would be the fact that while we all are equal in Messiah, nevertheless, we do retain individual preferences.
Yeah.
People are going to have preferences regarding music. There are white-angle churches that if I moved to a new area, I probably would not consider joining because the music is a very traditional music that I can't enter into worship through that music. I would probably look for a slightly more contemporary mixed form of music. Why? Because to me, if I'm standing there singing from the old red hymnal, then I wouldn't feel as though my soul is truly able to lift up to the Lord. So I want to be with folks who share that same preference. So to get away from the word cultural, because I fully understand the road you went down with that word, there are people who simply have preferences. And one of the chapters in Scripture that is most on this issue is Romans 14.
Oh, yeah.
Romans 14 tackles this issue and gives us freedom. So let me just read a couple of verses here from Romans 14, because there the issue was, once again, cultural preference. There were people there in the church in Rome who were from mixed backgrounds. There were people who were Jewish believers, people who were Gentile believers. The Jewish believers were looking at some of the cultural practices, and they weren't disturbed by them because they were saying, these are nonsensical goyisha, these are Gentile pagan practices, and we're not affected by it. Whereas the Gentile believers would say, oh no, that's the goddess so-and-so, we have to stay away from that. So each of these two believers were affected in very different ways to the same questions that were before the body. So in Romans 14, here is what from verse 1 following. It says, now accept the one who is weak in faith, but not for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. One man has faith that he might eat all things, but all things meaning including meat sacrificed to idols, which was the issue back then. But he who is weak eats vegetables only. You see that the man who is considered stronger is the man who recognizes that these things of the former life no longer have a hold on us. The fact that meat was offered to an idol, sacrificed to an idol, and then brought back out into the marketplace and is now selling for 50% off. You say, oh, what wonderful filet mignon at 50% off. Idol schmeidel. You don't care about idols. Whereas the person who is the weaker brother, all he's thinking of, oh, this meat was offered to an idol. I can't touch this meat.
All right, so let me get dangerous here.
Uh-oh.
We don't deal with that today. What do we deal with today? What's the modern version of that question?
I think that oftentimes it would be the issue of music, which is something a lot of people can relate to. I can listen to a contemporary song and not be reminded of a sinful past. Here's a real example. Speaking to a sister in Messiah, and she was telling me why she can't go to a number of contemporary congregations, because she says that driving music with a strong beat reminds her of, for her, bad old days of immorality in which she was involved in a lot of sinful practices. And to her, that music brings and dredges that all up for her and brings her to a bad place. She wants to be in a place where the music is extremely quiet and melodic. There's no even hint of any sort of rhythm.
You know what jumps out to me in that testimony there about this girl? She's for her.
For her.
The Romans 14 chapter is strong to saying it's okay to have a personal preference. It's not okay to judge based on that personal preference. So if she says, you know, I can't handle worship with a beat because it reminds me of my sinful past, so I have to avoid it. Wonderful.
Yes.
But if she says, that's evil music, it doesn't honor God, how can you listen to it? You call yourself a man of God. Therein lies the problem.
Exactly. And that's why, for myself, I have no such association. And so I'm fine with contemporary music. But even in the matter of preference, there are people in Southwestern churches who are going to want to prefer a Latino sort of music or a Latino sound. You know, what I would say to them in Yiddish is, Mazel Tov, enjoy. You know, we should all be free. And that's the whole point of Romans 14. The chapter is saying that each is allowed. Let me just read one more passage here in Romans 14. It says in verse 5, one man regards one day above another, another regards every day as being alike. Let each one be fully convinced in their own mind. He who observes it for the Lord. He who, and does so for the Lord. And he who does not eat this meat sacrificed to idols, he can also give thanks to God. So let each one be convinced in their own mind. So what verse 6 is saying is, it's not that one position is right or that one position is wrong. But Romans 14 is allowing us to have these preferences in how we go forward, while at the same time insisting that within the body of Messiah, there must be a unity. Just as that whole passage about the escaped slave said, the master who is a believer needs to regard him as being equal in worth to God.
So we need to respect personal convictions, right? Because that's what it's talking about. Let everyone be convinced in his own mind, speaking about personal conviction.
Yeah.
When someone has a personal conviction, you've got to let him walk in that personal conviction, because if you cause him to do something contrary to the personal conviction, then it becomes sin unto him. The Bible says that everything we do outside of faith is sin.
That's right.
So eventually we're leading him in a way where he has conviction that he's sinning. And of course that's going to bring condemnation. So we don't want to do that to that brother. We want to allow him to walk in that preference. And we hope that with time he will learn how to let others also walk in their own preference.
What Humberto just said is really the key. The same physical act might be totally innocent for one person, the eating meat sacrificed to idols, and he is able to go into the marketplace, plunks down his money and says, give me some of that delicious meat sacrificed to idols. The other fellow is hiding in the shadows, and he's waiting till they're about to close, and then he sneaks, psst, psst, hand me some of the meat sacrificed to idols. I don't want anyone to... For him, it's sin. The same act. Why? Because God doesn't look at the outward appearance of things. God looks upon the heart. He understands that the guy who was in the shadows was intentionally doing something that he thought was immoral or wrong.
And I suppose to wrap up that whole teaching lesson from Romans 14, we are taught not to judge and not to belittle on either side of those. So if I understand that you're a guy who has a problem with meat sacrificed to idols, I mean metal music, and I invite you over to my house, I do not serve you meat sacrificed to idols, even though I have a freezer full of it.
Right.
I don't play metal music during dinner because I know you have a problem. You think it's godless. I think you're immature and the weaker brother. What do you know? But that's not the point. The point is, I love you. Yeshua died for you. You're a man of God, and so I'll put on Mozart. To argue about it is missing the whole point. To being right is irrelevant. It's about being righteous. So be it music, be it meat sacrificed to idols.
And that is to put on Christ. That is to put on Christ, to honor and to love one another. That's what it's all about. And so again, the larger fellow or the larger individual will do that, because that's what it requires. It requires for us to be large. The Bible says that whoever amongst us believes is strong, the Bible says he should not please himself, but he should take care of his brother. He should care about his brother. So if I think that I'm strong, it's not because I'll for a greater argument or I win the argument. I am strong because I'm able to love him and to honor him even in his weakness. That's what it's about.
Absolutely. Romans 14, same chapter. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To his own master he stands or falls, and he will stand, for the Lord is able to make him stand. I was just sharing this from the pulpit this past weekend. When we judge people, we're tearing them down. God's trying to make them stand. So not only are we sinning because God says don't judge, but we're actually finding ourselves fighting God's plan for that person's life.
Oh my goodness, there it is.
Yeah. And in James it says, when you sit and judge your brother, you're not keeping the law, the Torah, you're sitting in judgment on it. And you're no longer a Torah keeper, now you're a Torah breaker. God is the judge. And it's as if we're saying, you're not doing a very good job. Off the throne, I'll sit there, and I'll show you how this really happens. That's what Romans and James are saying. I'm not exaggerating, I'm simply explaining. And so I think these passages that tell us not to judge one another and to encourage one another, to support one another. It's better not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything else that will cause my brother to fall into sin. So whatever you believe about these things, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the man who does not condemn himself by what he approves. And then the final verse in the chapter. But the man who has doubts, this is what you were referencing, the guy in the shadows, is condemned if he eats, because his eating is not from faith, and everything that does not come from faith is sin. Now that's the end of the chapter, but the next chapter, we who are strong ought to bear with the failings of the weak and not to please ourselves.
Yes.
Each of us should please his neighbor, his fellow human being, for his good and to build them up. And that's what the Shepherd's Heart is all about. We'll see you on the next episode. God bless you hard.
This program was produced by and for God's Learning Channel. If you enjoyed this program, we need your support to help keep this program on GLC. Please make your checks out to God's Learning Channel, P.O. Box 61000, Midland, Texas 79711-1000. Please be sure to designate where your contribution is intended. It is very important to let GLC know which programs you enjoy and support.
Order your copy of this program from the GLC bookstore by calling the numbers or visiting the website on your screen. Please include the program number when ordering.